The moment Maria Holloway stepped off the stagecoach in Dust Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she knew with absolute certainty that the man who had written her those 12 tender letters was nowhere to be found, and that the town around her was every bit as raw and unforgiving as she had feared it might be. The stagecoach driver, a stout fellow with a silver mustache and kind eyes, handed down her 2 traveling trunks without ceremony, tipped his hat, and rolled on toward the next relay station before the dust had even settled around her boots. Maria stood in the street, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a blue bonnet that had survived the 3-week journey from Richmond, Virginia, only because she had kept it in her lap for the entire rattling, bone-grinding ride. She was 24 years old, and she had sold nearly everything she owned to buy the ticket west. Dust Creek was a settlement of perhaps 300 souls, most of them cowboys, cattle ranchers, and the various merchants and tradespeople who orbited that world like moons around a rough and grassy planet. There was a saloon, a general store, a livery stable, a small clapboard church, and a scattering of houses that grew sparser and more weather-beaten the farther they sat from the main street. The sky above it all was enormous and pale blue and cloudless, and the wind that swept down from the north carried grit that tasted of iron. Maria pulled the letter from her coat pocket and read the address again. Clayton Hayes, Ridgeline Road, 2 miles east of Dust Creek. She had memorized those words on the train to St. Louis, on the stagecoach through Kansas, through Oklahoma Territory, through the long hot miles into Texas. She had pressed the letter flat against her chest on the night she crossed the Red River, listening to the thunder roll across the plains, and told herself that the man who wrote with such care and such honesty was worth the crossing. His first letter had come through the Richmond Bridal Correspondence Bureau, which she had turned to after her father died, and left her with nothing but a small house that needed selling and a mountain of quiet grief. The Bureau had advertised itself as a respectable enterprise that matched women of good character with established men in the Western Territories, who required a steady partner for frontier life. She had read those advertisements with skepticism, and then with curiosity, and finally with the particular kind of desperate hope that comes when every other door has closed. Clayton Hayes had not written like the other men. She knew because the Bureau allowed her to review several introductory letters before committing to a correspondence, and the others had been brief, transactional things that described acreage and cattle counts and the dimensions of a barn. Clayton had written about the silence before dawn, when the ranch was still and the stars over Texas were so thick and low you could almost believe the sky was breathing. He had written about his mother who had died the previous winter and how the house had felt different since, heavier somehow, like it had forgotten what warmth was for. He had written that he was not a poetic man and that she should not expect poetry, but that he believed in honesty and in working hard, and in the idea that 2 people who chose each other carefully might build something real. She had written back, and then again. 12 letters in total, passing between Richmond and Dust Creek over the course of 5 months, each one a little longer, a little more revealing, until she felt she knew the shape of him even if she did not yet know his face. And now she was here and he was not. She asked at the general store, a low building with a hitching post out front and barrels of flour and coffee stacked just inside the door. The man behind the counter, a lean fellow named Gus with a freckled scalp and reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead, knew Clayton Hayes immediately. "Sure, I know Clay," Gus said, leaning on the counter with his elbows. "He came in 2 days ago, said he had some business up in Abilene, cattle business. Something about a contract with a buyer up there that needed settling in person. Said he'd be back by Thursday or Friday at the latest." Maria looked at him steadily. "Today is Thursday." Gus rubbed the back of his neck. "So it is." "Well, he may still make it by evening. You his intended." "I am," she said. "Maria Holloway. I arrived on this afternoon's stage." Gus looked genuinely pained on her behalf, which she appreciated. He knew you were coming this week. I expect he figured he'd be back in time. Clay's not the kind of man to leave a lady standing in the street on purpose, I can tell you that much. His ranch is 2 miles out. You could wait here in town, or I could have Ned at the livery fix you a wagon to ride out." "I will ride out," Maria said, because she was not the kind of woman who waited in streets. Ned at the livery was a quiet young man of perhaps 19, who hitched a mule to a small flatbed wagon without complaint and helped load her 2 trunks onto the back. He drew her a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "Follow Ridgeline Road east. Stay on the high side when the road forks. Look for the fence line with the unpainted posts, and you will see the house sitting on a low rise above a dry creek bed." The ride out was beautiful in the particular savage way the Texas plains are beautiful in late April, when the buffalo grass is green and the wildflowers come up between the rocks in colors that seem too bright to be real. Maria drove the wagon herself, the mule plodding steadily, and she watched a pair of red-tailed hawks circle above a mesa to the south and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, some tight knot of anxiety that had been there for weeks. The house was exactly where Ned had described it. It sat on the rise above the dry creek bed, a square, solid structure built of dark wood and stone, with a broad front porch and a stone chimney at each end. It was not a beautiful house exactly, but it had good bones. It had been built to last. There was a barn behind it, larger than the house, and a corral beside the barn where 3 horses stood together at the far rail, watching her approach with the mild interest horses reserved for strangers. She tied the mule at the porch post and went to the front door. It was unlocked. In 1878 Texas, many men left their homes unlocked when they were away for a short time, and Clayton Hayes was apparently one of them, which she found herself quietly grateful for. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was cold, not merely cool the way an unheated room is cool on a warm spring day, but cold with the deep, settled chill of a place that had not held warmth in some time. The kind of cold that seeps into wood and plaster and makes them forget the feel of fire. The interior was dim, the curtains half drawn over 2 small windows on the front wall, and in the gray light she could see a main room that served as both sitting area and dining space, a kitchen beyond it through an open doorway, and 2 closed doors that she supposed led to bedrooms. The furnishings were sparse but solid. A round table with 4 chairs, a settee upholstered in dark fabric that had seen better days, a stone fireplace, large and well-built on the east wall, its hearth swept clean of ash, the grate empty. A shelf of books beside it. She counted perhaps 20 volumes, more than she had expected, and felt the same small warmth she had felt when she first read his letters. A rifle hung on pegs above the door. Boots sat beside the hearth. A coat hung on a hook by the entrance, evidence of a man who lived here alone and had lived here long enough to make small habitual arrangements. There were no flowers, no candles lit against the gray afternoon light. No fire in the grate, no food on the table, no sign that anyone had anticipated her arrival with anything approaching ceremony. Maria set her bonnet on the table and looked around the room for a long, steady moment. Then she went to work. She found wood stacked in a lean-to shed attached to the back of the house, good dry mesquite logs and a pile of split kindling, enough to last several days. She carried loads of it inside and stacked them neatly beside both fireplaces, because she had found on her walk through the back of the house that there was indeed a fireplace in the larger bedroom as well. She found a tinderbox on the kitchen shelf and used it to light the kindling in the main room fireplace, feeding it carefully until the mesquite caught and began to breathe its slow, rich heat into the room. In the kitchen, she found the situation both better and worse than she had feared. There was a cast iron stove, large and serviceable, with a pipe that ran up through the ceiling. There was a full barrel of cornmeal, a sack of dried beans, a string of dried chili peppers hanging near the window, a tin of coffee, a small jar of lard, a half-round of hard cheese under a cloth, and several jars of what appeared to be preserved tomatoes and peaches from the previous summer's putting up. There was no fresh meat and no fresh bread, but she had worked with less. She built a fire in the stove and set a pot of beans to soak and then to simmer on the back burner, flavoring them with lard and a length of the dried pepper. She found a cast iron skillet and made a pan of cornbread from the meal, cracking it open when it was done to smell the steam, which was as good a smell as she had encountered in weeks. She made coffee, strong and dark, and poured herself a cup and stood at the kitchen window drinking it while the late afternoon light turned gold and orange over the dry creek bed below. Outside, she could hear wind moving through the grass and somewhere to the south, the distant lowing of cattle. She explored the rest of the house with her cup still in hand. The larger bedroom had a good iron bed frame with a stratic mattress and a heavy quilt, the quilt old and much washed but clean. A washstand with a basin and a pitcher, a wardrobe that held 2 work shirts, a pair of canvas trousers, and a good black coat that had been brushed and hung with care. She touched the sleeve of the black coat and wondered when he had last worn it, and to wear. The smaller bedroom was empty of furniture except for a plain wooden chest in the corner, which she did not open. She went back to the main room and lit the 2 oil lamps she found on the shelf, trimming their wicks and filling them from the lamp oil she located in the kitchen cabinet. She drew back the curtains on all the windows to let the last of the evening light in, and then, when that light failed, she was ready with the lamps. She found a rough broom in the kitchen corner and swept the main room floor, which was not very dirty but benefited from the attention. She found a rag and wiped down the table and the window ledges. By the time full dark had settled over the Texas plains, the house was transformed. Both fireplaces burned, the one in the main room large and generous, throwing orange light across the walls and warming the floorboards. The oil lamps glowed on their shelf and on the table. The smell of beans and cornbread and coffee filled every room. The curtains were back and the windows reflected the firelight like amber mirrors. Maria sat at the table with a bowl of beans and a wedge of cornbread and ate her supper alone, listening to the wind against the walls and the occasional creak of the settling house, and thought about the 12 letters in her trunk and the man who had written them and how strange it was to be inside his life before she had ever looked into his face. She was just setting her bowl in the kitchen wash basin when she heard hoofbeats. They came from the east, coming fast, then slowing as they reached the yard. She heard the horse blow and stamp, heard boots on the porch steps, and then the door opened. Clayton Hayes stopped in the doorway of his own house as if he had walked into the wrong place. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she had imagined from his letters, with dark hair that was dusty from the road and a jaw shadowed with 2 or 3 days of beard. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 more, and he wore a canvas duster over a dark shirt, and his eyes, even in the dim light of the doorway, were the particular gray-green of creek water in shade. Those eyes moved around the room, the fire, the lamps, the swept floor, the cleared table, the lingering smell of supper, and the expression that moved across his face was something she had not quite expected. It was not merely surprise. It was a kind of quiet undoing, as if something in him had been wound very tight for a very long time, and the sight of this room, lit and warm and smelling of food, had found the catch that released it. He looked at her then, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish rag in her hands, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched out long and significant between them. "Miss Holloway," he said at last, and his voice was low and rough from the road, the kind of voice that had spent more time in wind and open spaces than in conversation. "Mr. Hayes," she said. He pulled his hat from his head. "I am sorry I was not here when you arrived. The buyer in Abilene held me 2 days longer than I expected, and I rode through the night to make it back before." He stopped, looking around the room again. "You lit the fires." "The house was cold," she said simply. He nodded slowly, as if she had said something much larger than that. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him and hung his hat and his duster on the hooks beside the door, next to where his coat already hung. "It has never looked like this before," he said, so quietly that she almost did not catch it. She was not sure if he meant since his mother died or since he built it or since some earlier time she had no knowledge of and she did not ask. There were things that needed no asking about, not yet, not on the first night. "There are beans on the stove," she said, "and cornbread. I will heat it." He sat down at the table without further argument, and she brought him a bowl and a wedge of cornbread and poured him a cup of coffee, and he ate with the focused gratitude of a man who had been riding since before sunrise and had not eaten since whatever he had managed at a relay station somewhere in the early hours. She sat across from him with a fresh cup of coffee of her own and watched him eat, and he glanced up at her twice with an expression that was not quite embarrassment and not quite gratitude but something in between. When he finished, he set his spoon in the bowl and looked at her directly. "You are not what I expected," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" He thought about it carefully, which she could see him doing, that deliberate way his eyes went slightly distant when he was choosing his words. "Someone more frightened," he said. "I have heard of women who come out here and then turn right around when they see what it actually is. The Bureau writes optimistic letters." "The Bureau writes whatever will sell its services," Maria said. "Your letters did not. That is why I came." Something shifted in his expression. He looked down at the table, then back up at her. "I told you it was hard out here," he said. "You told me the truth," she said. "That was enough." They sat together in the fire-lit room while the wind pressed against the walls and the mesquite logs settled in the grate, and she told him about the journey, the train to St. Louis, the long stagecoach west, the Red River crossing in the thunder. He listened without interrupting, which she liked, and asked one or two quiet questions that showed he had actually absorbed what she said. She told him about her father, about selling the house in Richmond, about the particular kind of freedom that comes with having nothing left to hold you in place. He told her about Abilene. The cattle contract had been a good one, better than he had hoped, 40 head to a buyer who paid fair prices and did not try to renegotiate at the last moment, which, he explained, some buyers in that line were known to do. It would see the ranch through the summer and give him enough to spend on some repairs the barn badly needed. She asked about the ranch, and he talked about it with more ease than he had talked about anything else, the land itself, the creek that ran in wet years and went dry in drought, the way the grass came up in April, and what that meant for the cattle through the summer, the pair of horses he had bred from his mother's line that he was particularly proud of. He had 700 acres, he said, which was not large by Texas standards but was land he owned clear, every acre paid for. It was late when they finally ran out of things to say, or rather when the lateness itself became a thing that had to be addressed. "The bedroom is yours," he said, rising to take his bowl to the kitchen. "I will take the settee." "That seems unnecessary," Maria said, then colored slightly. "I only mean there are 2 rooms, the small one is empty." "There's no bed in it," he said, "nothing but an old chest." "I can sleep on a bedroll for a few nights," she said. "I have slept on far worse on this journey, or you can sleep on the bedroll and I will take the settee. I am not particular about my comfort." He looked at her steadily. "You are my intended," he said. "And until we are properly married you will have the bed and the privacy of your own room. That is not negotiable." She studied him for a moment, this tall, quiet, dusty man who had ridden through the night to get home to a woman he had never met, and something in her settled deeper and warmer than it had before. "All right," she said, "but tomorrow you should fetch a bedroll from the barn for yourself, because I have seen that settee and I do not think your feet will fit on it." He almost smiled at that. It was the first time she saw it, that expression that began as something careful and controlled, and then broke open slightly at the corners, and she understood immediately why he did not smile often, because when he did it changed his whole face and made him look younger and less guarded and entirely too appealing for anyone's peace of mind. "Good night, Miss Holloway," he said. "Good night, Mr. Hayes," she said, and took one of the oil lamps and went to the bedroom. She lay in the iron bed with the quilt pulled up and the lamp burned low, and listened to the sounds of the house around her, the fire dying in the other room, the wind outside, and at some point, the quiet sound of boots crossing the floor and the creak of the settee accepting his weight. She stared at the dark ceiling and thought about his face in the firelight when he first came through the door, that expression of quiet undoing, and she thought about how he had said the house had never looked like this before, and she pressed those words gently into her memory like flowers into the pages of a book. She was asleep before the lamp went out on its own. The next morning she woke before dawn, as was her habit, and dressed quickly in the cool bedroom air, and went to the kitchen to start the fire in the stove and the coffee. She found him already awake, sitting at the table in his work clothes with his elbows on his knees, staring at the cold grate of the main room fireplace. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did that careful rearranging that people do when they have been caught in an unguarded moment. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and went to the stove. She made coffee and scrambled 2 eggs she found in a basket in the cold room off the kitchen, cracked into the skillet with a bit of lard, and put that on the table with the leftover cornbread from the previous night, heated in the skillet until it was crisp on the outside. He ate with the same quiet focus as the night before, and she ate across from him, and the morning light came through the east-facing kitchen window and lay across the table between them like a third presence. "I need to go into town today," she said. "There are things I will need if I am to run this house properly." He looked up. "I can take you. The wagon is." "I brought Ned's mule and wagon from the livery," she said. "I should return them." "Right." He rubbed his jaw. "I'll hitch my own wagon and come with you. I have business at the feed store anyway." They drove into Dusk Creek together on the bench seat of his wagon, a better wagon than the one from the livery, with a proper seat and a matched pair of bays that were clearly the animals he had mentioned the previous night, well-mannered and responsive to the reins. She noticed how he handled the horses, with minimal direction and complete confidence, and she noticed the way he sat on the wagon bench, not sprawled but not rigid either, relaxed in the particular way of someone who has spent enough time in a given situation that it has become an extension of their body. The town received them with the kind of interest that small towns reserve for exactly this sort of arrival. She was aware of eyes at windows and from the general store doorway, and the way conversations paused when the wagon pulled up in front of the livery. He helped her down from the wagon with a hand that was careful and not presumptuous, and she thanked him, and they went separately about their errands, which she thought was exactly the right approach. She was not a woman who needed to be accompanied to a dry goods store. She returned Ned's mule and wagon and paid him for the use of it from her own small purse, which Ned tried to refuse and she politely but firmly insisted upon. At the general store, she introduced herself to Gus properly and bought what she needed: salt, baking soda, a tin of dried apples, a small quantity of white flour, 2 candles, a new dish cloth, and a small mirror for the bedroom washstand. Gus wrapped everything in brown paper and string, and told her she had made the right choice coming to Dusk Creek, which she thought was something he would have said regardless, but appreciated nonetheless. She was standing outside with her packages when she noticed the woman at the well at the end of the main street, a slender woman in her 30s with copper-red hair and a no-nonsense expression, who was drawing water with the efficient movements of someone who has not time to waste. She met Maria's eyes across the distance and came straight over. "You are Clayton Hayes' intended," the woman said. It was not quite a question. "Maria Holloway," Maria said, and extended a hand. The woman shook it with a firm grip. "Eleanor Marsh. I have the millinery on the east end of town. Clay's mother was a good friend of mine, and I have been keeping an eye on that man since she passed to make sure he does not forget to eat." She looked Maria over with direct, honest eyes and apparently found whatever she was looking for. "I think you will do," she said. Maria laughed, which surprised her, and the sound seemed to surprise Eleanor Marsh as well, who smiled properly for the first time. "Come have tea with me tomorrow afternoon," Eleanor said. The store is slow on Fridays, and I will teach you which families to trust in this town and which ones to step carefully around." "I will be there," Maria said. When she found Clayton at the feed store, he was talking with a heavy-set man named Denton who ran the local cattle association, and she waited at the wagon until he finished. He came out looking slightly relieved, which she would later learn was his typical expression after a conversation with Denton, who had strong opinions and the considerable local influence to back them up. "Ready?" Clayton asked, loading the feed sacks into the back of the wagon with a practiced ease that made it look effortless. "Ready," she said. On the way back out to the ranch, he said, "I spoke to Reverend Aldrich this morning. He can perform the ceremony Saturday if that suits you." She looked at him. That was 2 days away. "That suits me," she said carefully, "if it suits you." He kept his eyes on the road ahead, on the bays and the open grass. "I know it is fast," he said, "but the longer we wait the more complicated the talking becomes in a town that size, and he paused. "I would like things to be settled if you are willing." There was something in the way he said that last phrase, "if you are willing," that removed any sense of pressure from it. He was genuinely asking. "I am willing," she said. He nodded once, the way he did when something had been decided, and they rode the rest of the way home in the particular comfortable quiet that she was already beginning to recognize as one of his natural states. That evening, she cooked a proper supper with the supplies from town: dried apple fritters fried in lard, salt pork she had found in the cold room, beans again but flavored this time with the whole dried pepper, and a piece of the hard cheese melted into it. He came in from the barn at dusk smelling of horse and wood smoke, and washed his hands at the kitchen basin and sat down at the table, and they ate together and talked more easily than they had the night before. He told her about his mother. Her name had been Ruth, and she had come to Texas from Georgia after the war, following his father, who had died in a riding accident in 1872. Ruth Hayes had run the ranch herself for 3 years after that, hiring a hand named Obadiah when the work required more than one pair of hands, and she had been, according to Clayton, the most competent and the most quietly demanding person he had ever known. "She would have liked you," he said. "The way you just," he seemed to search for the words, "took over. That first night. I came home and the house was warm and there was food, and I thought for a moment that I had somehow come through the wrong door." Maria watched his face. "It was cold," she said again, "and I was hungry, and I'm not the kind of person who sits and waits for someone else to see to things." "No," he said with that careful almost smile, "I can see that. Is that a problem?" "No," he said, and meant it. Friday she went to have tea with Eleanor Marsh at the millinery, which was a warm, colorful shop crammed with hat forms and ribbons, and a small table near the back window where Eleanor had set out a teapot and a plate of sugar biscuits with the casual ease of someone who does this regularly. Eleanor proved to be exactly what Maria had hoped: direct, funny in a dry way, and enormously well-informed about the interior workings of Dust Creek's social landscape. She told her which families were kind and which were gossips. She told her that Denton at the Cattle Association was not a bad man, but needed to be treated firmly, or he would assume authority over things that were none of his business. She told her that the school teacher, a young man from Ohio named Mr. Pierce, was excellent with the children but slightly bewildered by Texas in general, and could be helped along with a bit of patience. She told her that the sheriff, a steady-tempered man named Hewitt, was trustworthy to a degree unusual in his profession in that part of the country. She told her that there had been some trouble the previous autumn with a group of men driving stolen cattle through the territory, and that Clayton had been one of the ranchers who rode out with the sheriff's posse to deal with it, and that he had handled himself well and come back without a scratch, unlike 2 of the other men. "He does not talk about it," Maria said. "He would not," Eleanor said. "He does not talk about most things. He is a man who carries a great deal quietly and sets it down slowly. His mother was the same. It is a Hayes quality." She poured more tea into Maria's cup. "You will need to be patient with him. Not because he is unkind, he is not, but because the trusting of people is something he does carefully. He writes those letters because writing gives him time to think before he speaks. Maria thought about the 12 letters and about the way he searched for words when he spoke, the same deliberate quality translated from pen to tongue. "I know," she said. "Good," Elinor said, and offered her another biscuit. On Saturday morning, she dressed in the best dress she had brought, a soft gray wool with white cuffs and a collar of small white buttons, and put her dark hair up properly and put on the blue bonnet, which had survived the journey intact and was therefore the best-looking piece of headgear she owned. She looked at herself in the small mirror she had bought and thought that she looked like what she was, a woman who had traveled a long way on her own and had not yet entirely arrived. Clayton was in the main room when she came out, wearing his good black coat from the wardrobe, his hair combed and his jaw clean-shaved, and he looked at her for a moment with that quality of stillness that was beginning to seem to her less like distance and more like a form of deep attention. "You look," he started, and then stopped. "Adequate," she offered. "Beautiful," he said, with the directness of someone who does not say something unless they mean it, and then looked away as if the word had cost him something, and she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire behind her. They drove into town together, and Reverend Aldrich married them in the small clapboard church with Elinor Marsh and Gus from the general store as witnesses. The ceremony was short and honest, the kind the frontier preferred, no elaborate ritual, just words that meant what they said, and a ring that Clayton produced from his coat pocket with the manner of someone who had been carrying it, and not quite knowing how to bring it out. The ring was simple, a plain gold band, but it fit her finger as if it had been made for it, which it had not. He explained later, quietly, that it had been his mother's, which she had given to him before she died and told him to give to the right woman. Maria wore it from that moment as if she had always been meant to. Gus bought them a drink at the saloon in the afternoon, which meant coffee because Maria did not drink spirits and Clayton rarely did, and Elinor gave Maria a small carved wooden box she said she had been meaning to give to the right person for some time, and which turned out to contain a set of good sewing needles and a collection of thread colors that were exactly what Maria needed. They rode home in the late afternoon, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure, that she was going home rather than simply returning to a place where she was staying. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that build a life without any single one of them being particularly remarkable. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the early mornings, the long working days, the evenings that settled into a shared quiet that felt increasingly natural. She took over the kitchen completely, which Clayton surrendered with visible relief, and she began learning what the root cellar contained and what the garden might grow if properly planted, because there had clearly been a kitchen garden behind the house at some point, the outline of it still visible in the earth, that had gone unplanted since Ruth Hayes died. She found seeds in the wooden chest in the small bedroom, which Clayton told her had been his mother's seed chest, carefully preserved in paper envelopes and labeled in a neat hand. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs, sage and thyme and rosemary, and one envelope labeled simply Mother's Roses in a different handwriting than the rest, which she later learned had been Clayton's grandmother's addition to the collection. She planted everything. She turned the garden soil herself on days when Clayton was out working cattle, spending mornings on her knees in the good dark earth. And by the end of May she had a kitchen garden that was showing its first green spears and would, by summer's end, produce enough to put up several months' worth of stores. He watched her work in the garden, sometimes from the fence line when he came in from the range, with an expression she was learning to read, something composed of equal parts gratitude and wonder, and a careful reluctance to assume anything, as if he was still not entirely convinced that any of this was real. One evening in late May she was putting up the supper things and he came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I have been thinking." She looked over at him, her hands in the wash basin. I would like to build another room, he said. On the south side, a proper room with windows and good light. He paused. For you, a room where you can sit and sew or read or whatever you want. A room that is yours. She looked at him for a long moment. That is not necessary, she said. I know, he said. She understood the difference between necessary and wanted, and she understood what it meant that he was drawing it. All right, she said. I would like that. He started on it the following week, on days when the cattle did not need him, and she watched the room go up with the particular satisfaction of watching someone build something with care and skill. He was good with his hands. She had seen that in a dozen small ways around the ranch. A fence post set with perfect precision, a gate rehung so it swung silent and true, and the room that grew on the south side of the house was framed straight and solid, with 2 windows as he had promised and a floor of proper planed boards. Alina came out from town twice during those weeks, driving her own small buggy, and the 2 women formed the kind of friendship that frontier life produces: fast, practical, and deep, built on shared work and real conversation, rather than the careful social performances Maria had always found exhausting in Richmond society. Alina had been widowed 5 years earlier, her husband taken by a fever in the winter of 1873. She had no children and had built her millinery business from nothing afterward, and she had a quality Maria admired tremendously: the ability to carry sorrow without becoming defined by it. You are good for him, Alina said one afternoon, watching Clayton through the kitchen window as he worked on the new room's framing. He has been not exactly closed but contained, like a house with all the curtains shut. This last month I have seen him speak at the feed store without that expression he usually wears, the one that says he would rather be anywhere else. He is still very quiet, Maria said. He is, Alina agreed. But there is a difference between a quiet that is peace and a quiet that is loneliness. He had the second kind before, and now he has the first. Maria thought about that on the evenings when they sat in the main room after supper, she with her mending or her reading and he with his account books or, occasionally, one of the volumes from the shelf. And the fire burned and the lamps glowed, and the house held them both with a solid, quiet warmth. She thought about the cold, empty room she had walked into that first afternoon, and about what it had cost to light it, not very much, as it turned out. Some firewood and some cornmeal and a willingness to move toward something rather than wait for it. June brought heat and clear skies, and the long summer work of keeping cattle watered as the creek ran lower. Clayton hired a hand for the summer, a young man named Jesse who was 17 and eager, and got things slightly wrong often enough that Clayton spent a good portion of his evenings explaining what had gone wrong and why, with patient thoroughness. Jesse ate supper with them twice a week, and was so transparently charmed by Maria's cooking that she found it funny and began making things she knew he particularly liked, which made Clayton look sideways at her with an expression that was clearly trying not to be amusement and failing. One evening in July, when the heat had finally broken and a storm had come through and left everything clean and smelling of wet grass and good earth, they were sitting on the front porch after supper watching the last of the lightning move east on the horizon. It was the kind of evening that felt suspended somehow, held out of ordinary time by the beauty of it. Clayton said, without looking at her, "I did not think it would be like this." She waited. "I thought it would be practical," he said. Which was what I wanted. What I told myself was the sensible thing, a capable woman for a working ranch. Someone who could manage the house and manage herself and who had no romantic notions about what this life is. He paused. I wrote those letters meaning every word of them. I wanted to be honest, but I did not expect. He stopped. Did not expect what? She asked quietly. He turned and looked at her then, in the way he rarely did, directly, full and unguarded, and the lightning was far east now and the night around them was very still. "You," he said simply. "I did not expect you specifically, what you are, the way you are." Maria looked at him for a long moment with the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something very large, and knowing that the step forward is inevitable and right. Clayton, she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and she watched the effect it had on him. Maria, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, all 4 syllables, careful and deliberate the way he was with everything that mattered to him, that made her feel the weight of it. She reached across and put her hand over his, where it rested on the porch rail. He looked down at their hands and then up at her face, and the expression on his face was one she would keep with her for the rest of her life. Not quite surprise anymore, because he was past that, but something rawer and truer, something that had been locked inside the contained, quiet man for a long time and was only now finding its way out. He turned his hand under hers and held it. They sat that way until the last of the lightning was gone, and the stars came out in enormous numbers above the plains, and the night was full of crickets and the distant sound of the creek, which had returned to running after the rains. After that evening there was a shift between them, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but is simply present afterward, like the change in a room's atmosphere after a window has been opened. He began speaking more freely, not carelessly. He was never careless with words, but with less of that careful withholding. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the year after his mother died, when the ranch had felt not like home, but like a punishment. About the doubt that had driven him to write to the Bureau, which had felt to him like an admission of failure until he had her first letter and understood it differently. He told her about his father, who had been a harder man than he perhaps needed to be, and about the way Clayton had spent most of his youth trying to earn an approval that was never freely given, and about how that had made him both very determined and very careful about what he hoped for. She told him things in return about her mother, who had died when Maria was 12, and about the years of managing her father's house and then watching her father decline, and about the particular loneliness of being capable enough that no one ever thought to ask how you were doing, because capable women were always assumed to be fine. "I am asking," he said, one August morning over coffee. "How are you doing?" She looked at him over her cup and felt something expand in her chest. "I am doing very well," she said, and meant it with a completeness she had not felt in years. By August she knew she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday evening after supper, when Jesse had gone home to his family's place 2 miles north and they were alone on the porch watching the prairie go gold in the dying light. She said it simply and directly, which was how she said most things. He went very still. The quality of his stillness shifted from the peaceful kind to the astonished kind, and he looked at her with his gray-green eyes wide and unguarded, and then he stood up from his chair, and she stood too, because it seemed like the moment called for standing, and he put his arms around her with a careful, encompassing gentleness that was wholly different from the brisk, controlled contact that had been between them before, and held her against his chest for a long time without saying anything. She could feel the steadiness of his heartbeat and the steady rise and fall of his breathing and the warmth of his arms, and she closed her eyes and pressed her face into his neck, and understood that she had not merely come west and found a practical arrangement. She had found the actual, specific thing that she had not known she was looking for. "A child," he said finally, into her hair. "Yes," she said. He pulled back and looked at her face, both hands on her shoulders, looking at her the way he had on that first stormy evening on the porch, undone and true. "Are you well?" he asked. "Do you feel—" "I feel entirely well," she said. "Better than I have in years, actually." He exhaled slowly, and then did something she had never seen him do. He laughed. Not the carefully managed almost smile, but an actual, open, delighted laugh that came up from somewhere deep in him, and changed his whole face, and made him look like the younger man he must have been before a long stretch of hard, lonely years had taught him caution. She laughed too, and it was the best sound the house on the low rise above the dry creek bed had heard in a very long time. In September, Denton from the Cattle Association came riding out to the ranch with a proposal that Clayton was reluctant about, and she was immediately suspicious of. Denton wanted Clayton to drive a herd of 60 head north to the railhead at Abilene as part of a combined drive with 3 other ranchers in the association, which would take him away from the ranch for 4 to 6 weeks starting in early October. Maria listened to the conversation from the kitchen, where she was making bread and not pretending otherwise. When Denton had gone and Clayton came inside, she looked at him steadily. "You do not want to go," she said. "It is good money," he said, and sat down at the table. "That is not what I asked." He looked at her. "No, I do not want to leave you for 6 weeks. Not." He looked at her belly, which was not yet much visible but which was both of their constant awareness. "Not now. The baby is not due until March," she said, "and I am not made of glass, Clayton." "I know that," he said. "Then what is actually holding you back?" He was quiet for a moment. "I just found it," he said. All of this. I am not eager to leave it even briefly." She looked at him across the kitchen in the afternoon light, this careful, deliberate man who had spent years learning not to want things too directly, and she felt a rush of tenderness for him so strong it was almost difficult to speak through it. "Go," she said gently. "You will be back before November. I have a leaner and I have Jesse and I have the best kitchen garden in this county. I will be perfectly fine." He went, but not before he rode into town and had a long conversation with a leaner and a separate one with Jesse, and checked every lock on every door and window in the house, and left her with 3 months of firewood stacked along the back wall of the house instead of in the lean-to, so it would be close at hand. He also wrote her a letter, which he left on the table the morning he rode out, which she found after he had gone. It was not a long letter. It said that he had not expected to love anything this much, and that it had surprised him, and that he wanted her to know it before he left because some things should be said directly rather than assumed. It said that the house she had lit on the night she arrived had not gone dark since, and that he did not think it would again, and that whatever came next he intended to face it with her beside him. She read it at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, the October morning light coming through the window, and she pressed the letter to her chest and sat with it for a long time before she folded it and put it in the wooden box Alina had given her, beside the 12 letters she had kept from before. The 6 weeks while he was gone were busy ones. She had the kitchen garden's autumn harvest to put up jars and jars of tomatoes and preserved peaches and pickled beans that she lined up in the root cellar until the shelves were full. She had the new room to arrange, which he had finished framing and had left her to settle as she saw fit, and she spent several evenings considering and rearranging until she had it right: a rocking chair brought in from the barn where it had been stored, a small table beside it, the books from his shelf redistributed to include the new space, a piece of fabric she had bought from Alina's shop pinned at the window to serve as a curtain until she could sew it properly. Jesse came every morning to see to the horses and the cattle that remained on the property Clayton had taken the 60 head north, and was earnest and helpful and still slightly wrong about things in the endearing way of a 17-year-old who is genuinely trying. She taught him to make cornbread while he was there one afternoon, because he mentioned that his family mostly lived on salt pork, and by the end of the lesson, he was inexplicably proud of himself. Alina came twice a week and they talked for hours, trading information and opinions and sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence, which is the mark of a real friendship. She missed him. She had not anticipated quite how much she would miss him, which was an interesting discovery about herself, given that she had spent a considerable part of her adult life managing perfectly well alone. She missed the sound of his boots in the morning and the particular weight of his presence in a room and the way he listened when she talked, with his whole attention, steady and real. She wrote him a letter and sent it north with a rider who was making for Abilene the following week, knowing it would probably arrive after he had already turned south for home, but writing it anyway. It said that the garden was fully put up and the root cellar was full and the house was warm. It said that the mother's roses she had planted in the spring had done better than expected, and that one of them, the dark red one, was going to be spectacular next summer. It said that she had been thinking about what he had written in his letter, about loving something this much, and that she wanted him to know that the feeling was mutual and specific, and not the kind of thing she was prone to saying lightly. It said that she was fine and the baby was fine, and she was going to be watching the road east every evening from now until he came back. He came back on a Thursday evening in the first week of November, appearing on the road east as the last light of the day was gold on the grass. She was on the porch when she saw the riders coming, 4 of them in a loose group, and she could pick him out at the distance by the way he sat the horse before she could make out his face. She stood up from the porch chair, and he must have seen her because he lifted his hand, and then he was urging the horse to a canter while the others continued at their pace. He came into the yard at a canter and was off the horse and had his arms around her before she had taken 2 steps off the porch. He held her the way he had the evening she told him about the baby, with that careful, encompassing warmth, and she pressed her face into his neck and breathed the road dust and cold air smell of him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he pulled back and looked at her face and then looked at her belly, which had now become something noticeable, and his expression was the open, undone one that she had become her favorite thing to see on his face. "All right?" he asked. "Completely," she said. He picked up his saddlebags from where they had fallen and looked at the house, lit against the darkening sky with its warm windows and the smoke rising from both chimneys, and she watched him look at it. "It always looks like this now," he said quietly to himself more than to her. "I know," she said. He looked at her and his gray-green eyes were warm and direct, and she did not need to read 12 carefully constructed letters to know what was in them. "Come inside," she said. "I made venison stew. Jessie brought a deer yesterday and I have been cooking it since this morning." "Good Lord," he said, and the laugh was there again, that open, genuine sound she had learned to love. They went inside together. The winter that followed was the good kind of hard, the kind that tests things and finds them solid. They had several weeks of genuine cold in January that kept them close to the house, and the cabin fever that might have set in with another pair of people, instead, became an extended, intimate time that Maria would look back on later as one of the best months of her life. He read aloud to her in the evenings from the books on the shelf, and she was delighted to discover that he had a good reading voice, careful and clear, and that he enjoyed the reading as much as she enjoyed listening. She in turn showed him the detailed system she had developed for the household accounts, tracking expenditure against income with a precision that genuinely impressed him, and they spent several evenings going over the ranch accounts together, combining her systematic approach with his knowledge of the cattle business, and arrived at a plan for the following year that was considerably more solid than what he had been managing with before. She taught him to make bread, which he was terrible at but gamely continued to attempt. He taught her to ride, which she had known how to do theoretically from years of riding in the more sedate Virginia style, but which was different in the Texas way, and after 3 lessons she was handling the bay mare with a competence that delighted him visibly. In late January, during a brief warm spell, he took her out on horseback to the far east edge of his property, to a ridge that looked out over an enormous sweep of the plains, all the way to the low blue line of hills on the horizon, and told her this was where he came sometimes when he needed to think. "What do you think about up here?" she asked. He looked out at the plains for a moment. "Mostly about what to do next," he said. "And lately," he paused, "lately mostly about gratitude." She looked at his profile against the enormous sky. "Say that again," she said. He turned and looked at her, a slight color in his wind-reddened cheeks. "Gratitude," he repeated, "for all of this, the land, the ranch, you." He looked at her steadily. "Especially you." She looked back at him on that ridge with the January wind moving through the grass below them and the whole sky above, and felt the absolute completeness of it, this specific man, this specific place, this life they had built together from what had begun as 12 letters and a cold, empty house. "I love you," she said, because it needed saying directly. "I know," he said, and then, as if catching what he had done, I love you too. I have for some time." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn. "You are the best thing that has come to me, Maria, ever." She gripped his hand. They rode home in the late afternoon, and she made supper, and he fed the horses, and they ate together at the table that had felt so bare and cold on that first evening, which now had a cloth she had sewn from Alina's fabric and a jar of dried wildflowers she had collected in the fall. And the lamps were lit, and the fire was going, and the house held all of it, all the warmth and all the light, and all the evidence of a life being built with intention. March arrived with wind and the early warmth of a Texas spring, and with the birth of their son. He came in the small hours of a Tuesday morning, and Alina was there, having ridden out the previous evening when the timing became clear, and Jessie was sent to fetch the doctor from town, who arrived just at the crucial moment and confirmed afterward that Alina had done everything right, and that both mother and child were in excellent condition. Clayton spent the birth in the main room, because the doctor asked him to, which he obeyed with visible difficulty. When Alina came out and told him he could come in, he crossed the bedroom threshold with the careful movement of a man in a very sacred space. And when Maria put the baby into his arms, he stood absolutely still and looked down at the face of his son with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the careful rearranging, not the contained steadiness, but something entirely open and entirely new, as if the child had cracked something in him that was the last closed thing. "Hello," Clayton said to the baby, in a voice so quiet it was barely above a whisper, and the baby, who was red and furious and brand new, quieted immediately and blinked upward with the unfocused gaze of the very newly born. "He knows your voice," Alina said from the doorway, smiling. Clayton looked up at Maria with the open, undone expression that was by now entirely familiar to her and entirely beloved. "What would you like to name him?" he asked. They had discussed names over the winter, a conversation that had moved comfortably back and forth without reaching a conclusion, because neither of them was in a hurry. Now the child was real and present and needed to be named. "Thomas," she said, which had been her father's name. "Thomas," Clayton repeated, looking at the baby. "Thomas Hayes." He looked back at her. "That is a good name." "I thought so," she said. Alina stayed 2 days, sleeping in the small bedroom on the bedroll that had been there since autumn, and fed the household and bossed Clayton around with a comfortable authority he submitted to without complaint. And when she went back to town on the 3rd morning, she hugged Maria for a long time at the door and said, "You have done well, Maria Hayes." It was the first time she had heard herself called that. "Thank you," she said, meaning for more than just the last 2 days. The spring and summer that followed were a kind of controlled, beautiful chaos. Thomas Hayes turned out to be a determined, vocal, physically ambitious baby who met every developmental milestone slightly ahead of when the book suggested he might, and required the energetic attention of both parents to keep him from conducting experiments that were beyond his current skill set. Clayton took to fatherhood with the same careful, thoroughgoing seriousness that he brought to everything that mattered to him, and became, without any apparent self-consciousness, entirely besotted with his son. Maria watched him with the baby in the evenings, Thomas in his arms, and both of them apparently absorbed in a discussion that consisted on one side of quiet, serious sentences about cattle and weather and land, and on the other side of enthusiastic and largely vowel-based contributions, and she felt a happiness so complete it was almost impossible to hold. The kitchen garden produced magnificently that second summer. The mother's roses came up exactly as she had hoped. The dark red one was indeed spectacular, climbing the new room's south-facing wall in a manner that must have been its ambition all along, and the sight of it stopped her every morning when she went outside. Alina came to Sunday dinners regularly and became, over that summer, such a fixture of the household that Thomas began to recognize her and reach for her with the demanding confidence of a child who expects to be held. Alina, who had spent years telling herself she had made peace with not having children of her own, held Thomas with an expression that made Maria quietly resolve to make sure the boy grew up knowing a leaner as family, because clearly that was what she was. There was also the ongoing situation of Jesse, who had turned 18 that spring and who had been, Maria had noticed for some time, conducting a very carefully managed not-quite courtship with the miller's daughter in town, a cheerful, strong-willed girl named Annabel who came to the ranch twice to bring ground meal and stayed considerably longer than the transaction required. Maria mentioned this to Clayton, and he said he had noticed the same and was hoping Jesse would resolve it before the situation became distracting during cattle work, which was the most Clayton Hayes thing it was possible to say about a young person's first love. She told Jesse directly one morning that if he was going to court Annabel properly, he should ask her father's permission and stop lurking around the mill on invented errands. Jesse went bright red and looked at the ground and said he did not know how to proceed, and Maria told him she would write him a draft of an appropriate opening conversational gambit, which she did, and which he memorized and used, and which worked, because Annabel's father was a reasonable man and Annabel herself apparently required very little convincing. By late summer, Jesse was stepping out with Annabel on Sunday afternoons with her father's blessing, and his work on the ranch had improved noticeably, which Clayton attributed to the focusing effect of having something worth working toward, a theory Maria found entirely plausible. The second autumn passed, and the second winter, and the world settled into the shape of their life together, which was full and real and occasionally very hard in the practical ways that frontier life is hard, and which was also warmer and more alive than either of them had, in their different ways, known how to hope for. In the spring of 1880, 2 years after Maria had stepped off the stagecoach in Dust Creek with her blue bonnet and her 2 trunks and her particular kind of determined hope, Clayton rode out early one morning and came back in the late afternoon with a wagon from town loaded with lumber. She came out to the porch and watched him unload it with Jesse's help, stacking it neatly beside the barn. "What is this for?" she called. He came around the wagon, pushing his hat back. "The house," he said. "I am going to build it bigger, a proper room for Thomas and another room," he paused, "for whoever comes after Thomas if they do." She leaned on the porch rail. "If," she said. He looked up at her with the careful, almost smile she had learned was his best form of happiness when it was the quiet, interior kind. "The doctor says you are well and the timing is favorable." She had told the doctor in a quiet conversation 3 weeks earlier, not yet ready to say anything to Clayton until she was certain. She looked at him now and saw that he had the same expression he had worn when she had told him about Thomas, that open, astonished, wholly uncontrolled delight. "When did you see Dr. Haynes?" she asked. "Yesterday," he said. "In town. He mentioned he had seen you recently." She pressed her lips together to hold the laugh in. "He was not supposed to tell you." "He did not tell me anything," Clayton said, coming up the porch steps. "He asked me how I was managing in a very leading way, and I drew my own conclusions." He stopped in front of her. "Are you well?" "Completely," she said, which was both their word for this. He put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her properly, right there on the porch in the full spring light where anyone coming up the road could see them, which was not a thing he was normally inclined to do, but which felt, in this moment, like exactly the right thing, and she kissed him back with her hands on his arms and the warm April sun on both of them. "I love you," he said, when they drew apart. "I know," she said, mirroring his own response from the January ridge 2 years earlier, and he recognized it immediately and laughed. Over the summer he built the addition with Jesse's help, and with 2 hired carpenters from town who arrived on Monday mornings and left on Friday evenings and produced good clean work that doubled the size of the house. Thomas, who had become mobile and opinionated, and absolutely convinced that any ongoing construction project was specifically for his benefit, contributed mostly by attempting to pick up tools that were too large for him, and narrating the proceedings in a mixture of real words and invented language that seemed, to his own satisfaction, completely coherent. Clayton spent much of the construction process redirecting Thomas from dangerous proximities with a patience that impressed even the carpenters, who had children of their own and recognized genuine parental competence when they saw it. The addition changed the character of the house in the way that good expansions do, not by making it unfamiliar, but by revealing that it had always had the capacity to be larger. The new rooms were bright with the south and east windows Maria had specified, and she put good curtains on all of them and a proper hook rug on the central hall floor, and the mother's roses were visible from two of the new windows, climbing the south wall in red and green. Eleanor came to see the completed work in September and stood in the main room, which was now connected by a broad hall to the new wing, and turned slowly in a complete circle looking at the walls and the light. Ruth Hayes would be speechless, she said. "Is that good?" Clayton asked. "That is the highest possible praise," Eleanor said firmly. Maria stood in the kitchen doorway watching the two of them. Eleanor, who was as close to family as anyone who was not blood could be, and Clayton, who was every letter he had ever written her and a great deal more besides, and felt the full weight of what had been built here. Not just the addition or the garden or the root cellar full of stores, but all of it, the whole life, lit and warm and running forward into a future that seemed to her, in that moment, genuinely wide and genuinely good. Their daughter arrived in November of 1880, on a night when the first real cold of the season had come down from the north, and the wind was pressing against the walls of the house with considerable force. She was smaller than Thomas had been, and quieter, and she looked at the world from her first moments with a calm, measuring attention that Clayton recognized immediately as a quality he was quite familiar with. "She has your eyes," he said, looking down at the baby in Maria's arms in the lamplight. "She has your expression," Maria said, "the one where you are deciding whether something is trustworthy." He looked at the baby, who was indeed regarding him with a focused gravity remarkable in a person approximately 4 hours old, and said, "Hello, then, I am your father." The baby appeared to consider this. "Ruth," Maria said, which she had been saving for the right time and which was now clearly the right time. Clayton was quiet for a moment. "Ruth," he said. "If you approve," she said. He looked at her over the baby's head with the expression she loved best, the one that had no performance in it at all, the one that was just him, direct and open and real. "Ruth Hayes," he said. "Yes." Eleanor came the following morning and held the baby with the same look she had worn with Thomas, though more settled now, more certain of her place in the life of this child. And Maria watched and thought about the peculiar gifts that the West had given her, a husband who had written 12 honest letters and become, improbably and entirely, the person she had hoped he was. A son who had his father's steadiness and her own determination. A daughter named for a woman who had planted seeds that were still growing. A friend who had been a stranger 4 months before she arrived and was now as necessary as the kitchen fire. She thought about the afternoon she had arrived at the cold, empty house and lit it herself, carrying the wood in from the lean-to in her good traveling dress, kneeling at the cold grate with the tinderbox, feeding the flame until it caught. She had not done it to make a statement. She had done it because it was cold and she was practical. But she understood now that it had been something more than that, in the way that practical actions sometimes carry more meaning than they appear to. She had lit the house because she intended to live in it. She had lit it because she was already, in the only way that matters, at home. Ruth Hayes settled into the household with the tranquil certainty of a person who has always known exactly where she belongs. Thomas, aged nearly 2, accepted her with initial suspicion that resolved rapidly into proprietary pride, and spent considerable time explaining things to her that she was in no position to understand, which she appeared to find acceptable. The winter of 1880 and into 1881 was full in the way only a house with 2 small children, and a working ranch can be full of noise and need and warmth and exhaustion, and those particular moments of complete grace that come in the evenings when the children are asleep, and the house is quiet, and you are sitting beside the person you chose with your coffee cup, and the fire, and the absolute, settled rightfulness of where you have arrived. Jesse married Annabel in the spring of 1881, in the same small clapboard church where Clayton and Maria had been married, and Maria made the wedding cake from dried apples and good white flour and a careful hand, and Clayton stood beside Jesse during the ceremony with the quiet, steady presence he always had when something important was happening. At the reception afterward, which was held in the field beside the church because there was no building large enough to hold the guests, Clayton found Maria at the edge of the gathering and stood beside her looking at Jesse, and Annabel dancing to the fiddle player's music in the gathering dusk. "Do you remember our wedding?" he said. "Vividly," she said. "You were more nervous than you thought you were hiding." He looked at her sideways. "Was it that obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they watched Jesse and Annabel dance. And Thomas ran in circles somewhere near the food table in the company of several other children. And Alina was standing with the Aldriches and laughing at something the Reverend had said, and the fiddle music carried out across the plains in the warm spring evening. "I want to tell you something," Clayton said. She looked up at him. "When I rode home that first night," he said, "and I opened the door and saw the fire and the lamps and the all of it, all lit up and warm after everything it had been," he paused. "I did not know then that I was going to love you. It was too soon for that. But I knew," he seemed to search for the right word, "I knew that something was different, that whatever came next was going to be different, that you had done something to that house that I had not known how to do myself." She looked at his face in the evening light. "It just needed lighting," she said. "No," he said quietly, looking at her. "It needed you." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm with a gentleness that was entirely private in a field full of people. And she thought about 12 letters and a cold October train and a stagecoach across the plains and a cold empty house and a tinderbox, and how all of it had led to this exact moment, this exact man, this exact life. It had never looked like that before, he had said on that first night, standing in the door of his own house with the wonder of someone encountering something they had not known to hope for. It would always look like this now. The years that followed were the kind that build slowly into something so solid you can stand on it without thinking about the foundation beneath your feet. There were good years and hard years, the way all frontier years are both. There was a drought in the summer of 1882 that cost them 15 head and made the garden a daily battle against dry, cracked earth. And Maria hauled water from the deep well twice a day through that summer and kept every green thing alive through sheer stubbornness. There was a winter when Clayton had a fever that kept him in bed for 2 weeks, and she ran the ranch alone with Jesse's help and managed it without losing a single animal. There were also the years when the rains came right and the grass was thick, and the cattle market paid fair and the garden gave back everything and more, and they put money away in the bank in Abilene and talked about what the ranch might look like in 10 years, in 20. Thomas grew into a serious, capable boy who followed his father everywhere with the devoted focus of someone studying for an important examination, and who had his mother's directness and his father's careful way with things that mattered. Ruth grew into a girl of remarkable self-possession, who at age 4 had the quality of paying attention to everything around her with the measuring, deciding expression that her father had worn when Maria first saw him in the doorway, and who was, everyone agreed, going to be an impressive person when she was fully finished. Alina was there for all of it, for every Christmas dinner and every spring planting and every crisis and every celebration. She closed the millinery in 1883, not because it had failed but because she had made enough and tired of hats, and she spent more of her time at the ranch than in town, and no one pretended this was anything other than what it was. She was family. She was the children's honorary aunt and Clayton's closest friend outside of his wife, and the person Maria could always count on to say the true thing when the true thing needed saying. In the autumn of 1883, when Thomas was 5 and Ruth was nearly 3, Maria stood in the kitchen one morning in the early light and looked out the window at the mother's rose bush on the south wall, which had continued to grow and now covered most of that wall in a dense, magnificent climbing rose that was the most beautiful thing on the property by common agreement, and thought about Ruth Hayes the first, who had packed those seeds into paper envelopes and kept them through whatever the years had brought, knowing that someone would plant them eventually. She thought about all the things that get passed forward without our knowing where they are going, the seeds, the letters, the tinderbox in the kitchen, the gold ring on her finger that had been on another woman's hand before hers. She thought about the particular way this ranch and this house and this life had grown from things that already existed, from good soil that had been waiting, and she felt the completeness of it settle into her bones like the warmth of the fire on a cold morning. Clayton came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and came to stand beside her at the window, and they looked at the rose bush together in the early light. "I need to cut it back a bit this year," he said. "It is starting to climb onto the roof." "Don't you dare," she said. He looked at her sideways with that expression that began careful and broke open at the corners, the one that was still, after all these years, one of the best things she had ever seen. "All right," he said. "I will not." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his side, and they looked out at the rose bush and the clear morning sky above the Texas plains and the dry creek bed below the rise, which was running again after last night's rain, catching the early light in small silver flashes. From the hallway came the sound of Thomas's feet, running, which was his primary mode of movement, and then a louder sound that was Ruth asserting herself about something in the decisive way she had. And then both of them arrived in the kitchen with the force of small people who have been awake for some time and have decided that their parents have been alone long enough. Clayton let Maria go and bent down and picked Ruth up in one arm, and Thomas attached himself to the other side. And the kitchen was immediately full of everyone talking at once, and the smell of coffee and the fire in the stove, and the morning light coming through the east window in long golden lines. Maria looked at all of it, her husband with the children hanging off him, the warm kitchen, the window with the rose bush beyond it, the root cellar full of last summer's stores, the house she had walked into cold and empty and lit herself, and felt the thing that had no simple name but that was deeper and more complete than happiness. The thing that comes from having built something real with real intention and real love, and having the patience to tend it through every season until it grew into something neither of you could have imagined from the beginning. She poured 2 more cups of coffee, smaller ones in the tin cups that the children used, and set them on the table and called everyone to breakfast, and they came, all of them, all 4 of them, into the warm, lit kitchen on the clear Texas morning. The house had never looked like that before. It looked like that every day now. And it would, for all the years to come, through more seasons and more harvests and more difficult winters and more beautiful springs, through Thomas's eventual decision that he would be a rancher exactly like his father, and Ruth's eventual decision that she would be whatever she decided to be, and no one had better suggest otherwise, through Eleanor's slow, graceful aging in the chair beside the main room fire, through the long, ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life shared between 2 people who had chosen each other across a great distance with great care, and had never once, in all the years that followed, had reason to regret it. Maria Hayes, who had been Maria Holloway and had come west on a train and a stagecoach and a mule-drawn wagon from the livery, had arrived at a cold, empty house and lit it herself, and the man who came home had said it had never looked like that before, and both things were true. And both things would remain true long after the last word was said, and the last lamp was trimmed, and the fire in the good stone hearth was banked for the night, and the house stood warm and solid on its low rise above the running creek, holding all of it, all the warmth and all the light and all the life that love and one woman with a tinderbox had made.